Allow me to start with an anecdote. When I first started teaching, I was introduced to a program called Blookit. So, this is a program that promises to help students review content. The teacher creates a deck of questions with possible multiple choice answers. And then students get to play games that help them review, all while being very entertained. So it gamifies learning. And I thought, this is a win win situation. I get to teach, and the students are learning all while having fun. The games that my students enjoyed playing were Fishing Frenzy, where students are trying to fish for various animals, usually, although if they get a question wrong, then I think they fish for a boot. And then there was also one that was called Crypto Hack, where students are trying to guess each other's passwords. But what I came to realize was that students actually weren't learning from this program. Instead, kids were clicking as fast as possible through the questions, hoping that they would randomly get some questions correct. And it appeared to work pretty well because some students made it on the leaderboard, getting top 3, who didn't know the material. I only used Blookit to review grammar before a test, so maybe once a quarter. And I quickly realized that the students who needed the review were not benefiting from Blookit, and the students who already knew the material, well, they already knew the material and had nothing to do with Blookit. Furthermore, student behavior was off the wall. Kids were nasty to each other. There was a lot of screaming. There was slamming of computers. There were even kids who were crying because they didn't win. And so it was a classroom management nightmare. Once I realized that Blookit wasn't helping the students, I scrapped it. I decided I was never going to do this again. And we are seeing that increasingly the programs that educational technology companies promoted to public schools and promised would help students learn are actually not helping students. On the contrary, they might actually be causing more problems. Today, I would like to talk about what I call the Chromebook paradox. The paradox is that on the one hand, the increasing use of Chromebooks in schools are actually not helping learning. In fact, for the most part, they're hindering learning. And yet at the same time, students need to learn how to use computers, and they are not getting the formal computer education that children in older generations received. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, Eclectic Reads. I am a middle school English language arts teacher who, in addition to reviewing books on this channel, also talks about literacy on a broad level, so not just reading comprehension, though that is my focus, but also digital literacy and other kinds of literacy. If any of this sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and liking my content. Blookit is only one of a series of educational technology programs that have been sold to public schools across the country. But these are programs created by private companies, and private companies are all about profit. So, if these programs don't actually improve learning, then perhaps public schools need to reconsider. Recently, I finished The Digital Delusion: How Classroom Technology Harms Our Kids' Learning and How to Help Them Thrive Again by Dr. Jared Cooney Horvath. This book I would recommend to anybody who is concerned about the ubiquity of technology use in public schools across the United States. This book isn't opposed to tech, but is critical about how tech is employed in schools. According to Dr. Jared Horvath, the promises that edtech companies have been making to public schools in the United States for the last 20 years have largely failed to materialize. In fact, it appears that they have hampered learning and created a classroom management nightmare. It is very fashionable today to blame public schools for the lack of learning. But we need to look at the private companies that have bought our public schools, that have made promises, but they're only interested in their bottom line. They're interested in selling products. And if those products don't actually help learning, then maybe it's time to scrap them. Since the 2010s, these companies have been aggressively marketing to public schools, but it only got worse in 2020 with the lockdown. And now In most public schools in the United States, students are assigned their own Chromebooks and everything is done on computers. Everything from writing papers to submitting assignments to reviewing to learning, math, reading, you name it. Everything is done on computers. And parents are increasingly concerned about that. These are parents who are very concerned about screen time. They're following the data about how children should not be on screens for several hours a day. And yet the restrictions that they place on their kids at home are being undone in public schools. And so they want a tech audit. They want states to place limitations and for schools to really consider how computers are being used in school. And as a teacher, I will say I am totally on board because, as I mentioned, managing kids with their own Chromebooks is a nightmare. Thankfully, I teach in a school that does not assign Chromebooks to individual students, but I have been a substitute teacher at those schools, and it is really, really hard to manage. On March 19th of this year, reporter Kate Sequeira of the Los Angeles Times wrote an article about the pressure that parents are increasingly putting on school districts to limit screen time in schools. Here's what she writes. Parents said children as young as 4 are assigned lessons on tablets and Chromebooks as part of their academic instruction and are not always prevented from accessing apps such as YouTube and Minecraft during class, taking away from teacher-led learning. In 2026, at least 16 states, including Iowa, Vermont, and Virginia, have introduced legislation to reevaluate screen time or vet educational technology. At least 4 states, Kansas, Utah, Minnesota, and Tennessee, are considering prohibiting devices in at least part of elementary school. The movement to ban or strictly restrict screen time learning for elementary-age students comes as nearly 40 states have passed legislation to prohibit or restrict cell phone use in schools, including California, which passed a law that will take effect in July. And of course, EdTech is pushing back. In his 1964 book, Understanding Media, Marshall McLuhan famously wrote, "The medium is the message." In other words, a medium of communication is not just a vehicle of information, but causes structural changes in how we interact with each other and with the world. When we only focus on content, we miss the impact that the medium has on us. EdTech proponents might say that the Chromebook is just another medium. Students are learning the same material, it doesn't matter that if it's on a screen. But this fails to acknowledge the ways in which screens impact student behavior and just the behavior of anybody using computers. Research has shown that students comprehend less when they're reading on a screen than when they're reading on a paper because scrolling actually promotes scanning instead of deep focus. Here's what Dr. Horvath has to say. Have you ever tried to return to something you've read previously in a digital document, only to discover you can't find it? You know it was there a few scrolls ago, but now it's gone. That's because your brain is searching for a place. But on screens, place doesn't exist. Screens strip text of any static location. When we're reading an online article, words do not have a fixed location. This is very different than in a book. For example, what I just read from Dr. Horvath's book can be found on page 35 in the middle of the page. So if you have your own copy and you turn to page 35 in the middle of the page, you will find that quote. But if this were a digital document, unless the PDF had numbered pages, I would have to find where that quote is, and it would take me a long time, and I'd be scrolling and I'd be scanning. It would be a very different reading experience. And since reading online encourages scanning and word skipping, that is not going to help students who need to focus and read carefully, which is what's really important for state tests. Little wonder then that students perform worse on online standardized tests than they do on paper. And this is particularly true for students with learning disabilities. And since state tests are almost universally in the United States conducted online, it makes me wonder whether the results are actually accurate. When we look at state test results for math or for reading comprehension, is that truly a reflection of student ability? Or is the screen actually getting in the way so that the results are not completely reliable. Just some food for thought. Furthermore, children have grown up associating screens with short form content and with gaming, and they're always moving between tabs. So they're going to continue doing that when they're assigned anything in the classroom. That they're addicted to this. So they're going to continue to do that in the classroom. And of course, then there's AI. And one of my favorite sections in the digital delusion had to do with AI and how AI causes people to outsource their entire humanity. I made a short about that recently, but I'm not going to talk about AI in this video. That is a topic for an entirely different video. Dr. Horvath is not completely opposed to computers, although he does praise the Luddites who were opposed to technology. He proposes that schools do a tech audit, and I think that that is absolutely the best recommendation. Public schools need to go through and look at the programs that they are using, they have purchased, they have spent millions, well, across the country, billions of dollars on, and figure out whether it's actually helping learning outcomes or whether it's hindering it. And if it is, then they need to stop investing in these programs. And there's a lot of things that can be done analog. We're already seeing teachers who are asking students to write on paper. This should certainly be the norm in elementary and middle school. Maybe in high school, we can start to have students use computers more and more. Students think better when they're writing on paper, when they're doing math on paper. There's a lot of data that shows that it's better for learning. Tech audit questions that school districts need to ask: what programs lead to measurable results? How many minutes of screen time make sense for a child? Obviously that's going to differ for a child in 3rd grade and a child in 7th or 8th grade. How and when should students use Chromebooks? And finally, should students even have their own Chromebooks? And as a teacher, I am very pleased to see that public schools and states are confronting this problem. Nevertheless, I argue that schools do need to teach how to properly use computers. And this is where I disagree with Dr. Horvath, who argues that the point of school isn't workplace readiness, that students don't need to be taught how to use computers formally. I disagree. They absolutely do. And while the point of education isn't exclusively workplace readiness, I think that's part of it. Not to mention that students are already using computers at home. They need to know how to navigate them. They need to know how to critically examine articles for biases, to know where to find credible resources. This is so important. And when schools don't teach it, then we actually have a civic nightmare on our hands. One of the most pervasive myths out there is that children and adults today who are millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha are quote unquote digital natives. Coined by Mark Prensky in 2001, digital natives can use technology with ease. They don't need to be formally taught how to use technology because they've been using it since they were born. But if you're a teacher, you know that this is far from the case. True, students know how to play apps-based games, they know how to watch TikTok videos, but they don't know how to save and retrieve documents with File Explorer, they don't know how to format documents, and maybe most shockingly of all, they don't know how to type. My students type with one finger. Gen X and millennials were explicitly taught how to use computers in computer classes that took place in computer labs with computer teachers. We were taught how to type. We were taught how to use Macs and PCs. We were taught all of these very formally and systematically. Students today are not. And this is the Chromebook paradox. On the one hand, schools have given Chromebooks to individual students as young as like 3rd, 4th grade. If not even younger, there are kindergartners who are having to do things on computers. Everything is on the computer. Their assessments, their assignments, everything. And yet, on the other hand, students do not know how to use computers in ways that they will be asked to use computers in their professional lives. So we are not preparing them for how to use computers appropriately. And then we're surprised that kids misuse them in the classroom. We give them computers and we basically go, good luck, have fun. And boy, do they have fun. I don't know how much learning is happening, but they're definitely having fun. So, what is the solution to this Chromebook paradox? First, elementary and middle schools do need to reconsider how and when and where computers are used. Do away with the one-to-one Chromebooks. Honestly, before high school, children do not need to have their own personal computers that they're taking home. They don't. There can be grade level, maybe even classroom level computers that are available but are controlled by the teacher. You only take out the computers when something that needs to be done on screen is done on screen. Reading and math should primarily not be done on computers. It should be done on paper so that students can show their work, they can show their thinking, they can annotate, they can read more deeply. Bring back short paper-based assessments. Remember those blue book tests that you had to take when you were in school? They were great, and students can't use AI. Do away with the gaming programs that promise that children will learn. Your students are probably not learning very much, and all it does is feed their video gaming addiction, which they already have. And at the same time, bring back computer labs, computer teachers, teach digital literacy, teach how to find credible sources. This can be something that is taught by librarians or by other computer teachers, but teach students how to use technology appropriately. And if public schools cut back on edtech spending, they will have the money to be able to do these things. Okay? Like I said, billions of dollars are spent every year by public schools on products that don't actually help kids. If the medium is the message, we need to think about what message the medium of Chromebooks and tablets send to our students. Are they equipped to use these tools mindfully and critically? Or will they be yet another pawn in a system that values engagement over learning? Thank you for watching. Bye now.